Good evening, folks, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's talk, as Otto said, or hopefully our discussion tonight, is entitled Civil Liberties in the SNP. Now, we did consider civil liberties or the SNP, but perhaps we can get around to that later. So, why civil liberties? I think maybe we need to review ourselves here. It's fairly obvious for any long-term party member why we think about civil liberties, but for anybody who's relatively new to the party, allow me a brief explanation. First and foremost, UKIP is a libertarian party. We oppose the EU not simply because it is a corporatist behemoth of overweening arrogance, which of course it is, we oppose that too, but because it derides and it destroys every notion of liberty that our ancestors ever fought for. Its activist judges pontificate from Strasbourg, handing down rights that they have made up, while its unsackable bureaucrats take away our ancient liberties with the other hand. The EU is opposed by UKIP not because we object to other countries and heritages, nor for some long-standing grudge, but because it embodies a distinctly different tradition of rights and liberties from our own heritage. Our ancestors became freemen, not serfs. Our laws were built up gradually over generations with the consent of the governed, not decided upon in the back rooms of the powerful. Our freedoms were taken by our forebears by their own efforts and occasionally by their own blood, not granted by an emperor or a kaiser. The institutions of Brussels do not share that culture, and they do not share the love of liberty that it has granted us. It is a terrible indictment of our native political class, just how close they have come to cloning themselves on the Brussels commissars. Which of course brings us nicely round to the SNP. Nicola Sturgeon says she wants to be judged on her record. Fair enough. Let's do that, shall we? In March 2015, a man called Scott Lamont was sent to prison for 4 months. Anybody know what his crime was? Hello, hello, we are the Billy Boys. Hello, hello, you'll know us by our noise. Now, you all know the words of the song. And I've no doubt some people may find that offensive. That's fine. We're entitled to take offence. You're not entitled in this world not to be offended. But let's get a bit of perspective here. It's a song. Mr. Lamont sang about being up to his knees in Fenian blood. He didn't go out and get an axe and a claymore and wade into the opposition so that he was up to his knees in Fenian blood, did he? It's a song. But the sheriff jailed him because, and I quote, "A message has to be sent that this sort of behaviour will not be tolerated." Think about that just for a wee second. A song will not be tolerated. Singing a song is not tolerated in Scotland. That is down to the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, courtesy wee Nicola and the SNP. So let us move on. In February 2014, using the SNP's voting majority and in the teeth of opposition from every other party in Holyrood and from court judges right across Scotland, Kenny MacAskill, of infamous memory, pushed through his Criminal Justice Act. By doing so, he attempted to remove from Scots law a rather ancient principle, that of corroboration. Now, for those of you who are not lawyers, which is most of us, corroboration is the requirement that there be two independent pieces of evidence or two independent witnesses before charges can be brought. So if Nicola Sturgeon walks up and slaps me, I can't charge her for assault unless I have another witness. Now, luckily for all of us, there was quite a concerted amount of opposition. The Law Society of Scotland jumped up and down and screamed, the judges jumped up and down and screamed, all the other political parties, even the Greens, jumped up and down and screamed. And the Nats were forced to concede a review which was held under Lord Bonamy, And he came down firmly on the side of the ales in April this year and said we must keep corroboration. And the proposal was dropped. It was dropped. It is not dead. I personally have no doubt that it will rear its head again under a slightly different guise, and McCaskill's successor, Michael Matheson, has stated, and I quote, that there is still a case for abolishing corroboration, and that there will be a wider review after the 2016 election. Well, only if they win. But I think we ought to think that the very fact that the SNP were prepared to countenance miscarriages of justice, the jailing of the innocent, in order to secure more convictions, should give us all an awful lot of pause. Okay, let's move on to the next little item I've been on my agenda. In 2010, our friends, the National Party, pushed through an alcohol bill at the behest of the then Health Secretary, one Nicola Sturgeon. This bill banned irresponsible alcohol promotions such as buy one get one free, 3 for the price of 2 and so on. However, irresponsible goes rather further than that. A promotion falls into this category if it, and I'm quoting straight from the Act here, if it encourages or seeks to encourage a person to buy or consume a larger measure of alcohol than the person had otherwise intended to buy or consume. Now this, apart from obviously assuming that we citizens are too stupid not to be preyed on by the evil, nasty, alcohol-pushing publicans, it's really quite worrying, this. And quite obviously, and with the infamous exception of one Mary Black, the SNP appear to have forgotten the fine tradition some of our younger denizens have of going out to consume as much alcohol as possible in the shortest possible time. Precisely how any promotion could encourage somebody with that intention to consume more alcohol than they otherwise intended escapes me a little. It seems difficult to see how they would promote that. However, also in this bill, they attempted to enforce a minimum unit price on alcohol. Now that was defeated by the combined votes of all the opposition parties because in early 2010 the Nats didn't have a majority. However, they got one in the election that year, and up it popped again in 2012 and was shoved through Holyrood despite the opposition from everybody else. Fortunately for us, the Scotch Whisky Association has taken the legal challenge. They have made the comment that extant trade agreements prevent discriminatory rules on the sale of goods. Note, not sale of goods, not just the sale of alcohol. So this measure will probably fall. We think. We don't know. We're waiting for the judgment. The SNP also in this bill have sought, although not yet managed to force through, a ban on alcohol purchased by anyone under 21. Opposition to that idea is understandably widespread in Scotland, but it has prevented them from actually legislating for it.
Sorry. Are you saying that it would be that anyone under 21
would not be allowed to buy alcohol? Yes.
Anywhere
in Scotland.
It's like the Americans have to.
Anywhere in Scotland.
Ridiculous.
Yes. Now, the intention of all this is, of course, laudable. Scotland, we all know, has an alcohol abuse problem in certain parts, and premature deaths and serious health issues are a frequent consequence. Various arguments are given by the SNP and their supporting bureaucracy in regard to cost savings in terms of less crime, less hospitals, and even lives being saved by this measure. Now, all I can say is if anyone seriously believes that increasing the price of supermarket booze by a couple of quid a bottle is going to stop people becoming alcoholics, well, there's this big bridge I'd like to sail them, a big red thing over the Forth. Let us be brutally honest here. Alcoholism is not a consequence of cheap booze. There are alcoholics who drink only single malt whiskey, for God's sake. Doesn't make them any less alcoholics. Yeah? most alcoholics start out buying the same booze as everybody else at the same prices. So a price force doesn't really have any effect on alcohol. So we need to think, what were the underlying measures of that? So I'll give you a couple of seconds to think, and then we can move on to the next little issue of nationalist government. It's another vice which the nationalists believe we should be protected from: tobacco. Now, I'm going to make a point here. First, I don't smoke and I never have, so I don't actually have a dog in this fight. Bar the basic principle, of course, that it is for an individual to decide what they wish to imbibe and whether they wish to imbibe or not. But in April 2013, the SNP banned the display of cigarettes for sale. Apparently, we, the public, are too stupid not to be influenced by seeing them on display. We'll buy more. More recently, and despite evidence we've seen from Australia, the National Party have been considering forcing plain packaging on cigarettes in Scotland. Again, apparently we are all idiots who will be gulled into buying the cigarettes by the shiny wrappers that they're in. I make no comment. They have also decided to go along with the Westminster ban on smoking in cars with children. That's children under 18. You can, of course, smoke at 16, but they don't seem to have thought about that for a second. So those of you with kids better enjoy it while you can, because they want to ban it by the May election.
Does it include e-cigarettes?
E-cigarettes, they haven't yet worked out what they're doing with. Although they have managed to put a ban on e-cigarette use in NHS premises across Scotland, which includes the car parks. I'm not even going to go there, but... and the concept, of course, that simply being in a car, in traffic, exposes any child or anybody else in the car to rather more pollution than a single cigarette or even 20 cigarettes is actually going to chuck out. But are we starting to see a pattern here? Are we all starting to see a pattern here?
No, sir, not.
Well, let's continue. Now, last year, many of you here tonight will remember a talk by Otto. Otto gave a talk on something called the Named Person Scheme. Now, this particular legacy, which was introduced in the Children and Young People Scotland Act 2014, predicates itself upon the somewhat unusual idea that all children in this country need a state-appointed guardian to protect them from their own parents. Thus, every child in Scotland will have a named person appointed by the state on their behalf. This named person will be responsible for looking into the well-being of the child. Now,
Is that ongoing now?
oh, that's ongoing now. The well-being is a phrase you want to think about here. It's not exactly well defined. Nebulous at best, but the best I can find in official literature relates to the happiness of the child. So any of you with moody teenagers, any of you who happen to have a child who becomes an emo, you're all in trouble, aren't you? As for the parents, well, the parents, if I may use the minister's words, also have a role to play. In effect, parents should be aware that every state-funded and state-regulated organisation will be compelled to collect and to hand over children's and associated adults' data to state-appointed named persons who will, in effect, have carte blanche to share that information without their consent. As you can see from that, the powers of the named person are, to put it mildly, excessive.
And the parents aware of who they've got as a named guardian?
You might be. I'll get to that actually. I've got a case which is an example of that. Now, as Otto previously explained in his talk, and he actually brought the Act with him, he brought a copy of the Act. The named person, in effect, has the right to access the child's medical and scholastic records. They also have the right to access the parents' medical and financial and criminal records without consent. although the government in Holyrood claims this is not the case, the provisions are still there in the Act, exactly as you brought them here last year, Otto. Moreover, parents need not be informed of what information is being sought. They have no say in who is appointed or what, if any, actions are decided upon for their child. And the process for appealing against either an appointment of or a decision by a named person is, well, I've seen the flowchart. It's tortuous, to say the least. The Campaign Against the Scheme, which is No to NP, has compared the appeal process as crawling over broken glass. In effect, the Scottish National Party...
If anyone doesn't know, there's the web address and stuff for it.
Okay. I was going to bring that up later also, but if it's okay. In effect, the SNP are saying to us, we do not trust you to bring up your own children, so we are going to appoint a spy in every family to ensure that you do it the way we tell you.
Couldn't make that up, could you?
Unfortunately not.
So
Named person...
all over again.
Named person allegedly comes into force next year, but trials have already been rolled out, and therefore we have examples of how this legislation can affect us. Now, the leaflets that Otto has pointed out have 4 or 5 examples which you can all read, but this one I'm going to read out is not on this list. It involves a woman in Perth who already had a 6-year-old daughter, and she was forced to give birth to her son at Dundee Nine Wells, which, for those of you who live in Perth, will be wondering why PLI exists. Not PRI, because she, like hundreds of thousands of other people across the UK, including me, admits to have had occasionally suffered from anxiety or depression. So she had to give birth at Dundee Nine Wells, where they had mental health facilities. It gets worse. A named person report, which she did not even know existed, came close to her losing custody of her newborn child. A private conversation with a nursery teacher was reported in that report, and an aside she'd made that one morning her daughter, who normally jumps on the bed to wake her up, hadn't done so but had popped down to the kitchen and then decided to bang on pots and pans to wake mummy up instead, as, 6-year-olds might be wont to do, was written as child playing unsupervised in the dangerous environment of a kitchen while the parent was asleep. It was written up in such a way that she could be accused of neglect. Fortunately, she managed to get past that, but that's still the issue. Yeah? Now, the leaflets we have show other similar cases, but just on Sunday, we learned that a named person in Elgin has been convicted and placed on the sex offenders register for sending offensive and indecent messages on the internet relating to child sex. So, even in the rollout phase, in a town the size of Elgin, which is 20,000 people, the SNP are not even vetting their named persons properly. How they're going to do that when they have to roll it out for 1 million children across Scotland, well, doesn't that make you feel really safe? And it gets worse. The named person, you can make this up, they will not get any proper training. They're likely to get an afternoon, maybe a full day training, and that's going to be it. And none of the named persons are going to be child behaviour specialists. They will be head teachers, usually, maybe guidance teachers in secondary schools, or health visitors, who will be expected to take on these additional responsibilities in addition to their already moderately demanding jobs. I've been a teacher. It's not exactly 9 to 5, 6 hours a day. Not surprisingly, less than 1 in 5 such professionals consider the named person scheme workable. More than half believe, and I quote, they have never even had sufficient guidance to know what their responsibilities are. So how they're supposed to go into the role is actually quite difficult to understand. But the SNP say, you can check this, it's all on the Scottish Government website, the Act does not give the named person a monitoring role. Actually it does. The named person role will not overburden teachers or health staff. Well, teachers and health staff seem to disagree with that, so I think they're probably wrong there too. The creation of the named person service does not change privacy laws or infringe on human rights. Yeah, wrong again. Children and parents have no obligation to use the service or to take up the advice or help offered. Well, their own advocate argued in the Court of Session that there is no opt-out clause from named person. So they're either wrong yet again or they're blatantly trying to fool us.
Do the general followers of SNP that are so blinkered, do they ever think about these things when they're voting for them?
You'd have to ask them.
I asked a friend on Facebook about that, and he said he didn't care. It was before the general election. He just said, I'm voting SNP to get Scotland's voice heard. And I was like, okay, well.
Okay, fair enough. But I've got one final comment from their website. You may feel free to laugh or cry as you feel appropriate. A named person does not replace or change the role of a parent or carer or undermine families.
Is that right?
Right. Let's move on again, shall we? Those of you...
The number of children under...
There's 1 million children in Scotland. Every single child will have a named person.
Yeah, but a named person, how many children?
Up to the age of 18.
They haven't seemed to work that out. I believe they're looking at perhaps 200 per named person, perhaps more. Now, if you think about the number of hours, number of working days in a year is about 200. So that means each child will get 1 day a year, assuming that the named person does nothing else but named person duties. Where they're supposed to get the time, Christ only knows. However, let's move on again, shall we? Now, those of you who are familiar with Africa will recognise this next one. Land reform. Now, the Land Reform Scotland Bill is, thank God, not yet in force. Not because they haven't tried. It is, however, almost definite that it will eventually get pushed through and that Holyrood will take to itself the power to order the sale of private land. One of the fundamental underpinnings of our society for hundreds of years, the idea that your property is yours and that the state can't take it off you, is being dismissed at a stroke by the ideologues of the SNP. The justification? Well, apparently, if a landlord's actions constitute, and these are the words they're using, a barrier to sustainable development, then the minister may intervene. We are, of course, still awaiting precisely the meaning of barrier to sustainable development, but it's a pretty broad brush phrasing, so let's not kid ourselves. It will enable the Nats to dole out parcels of land seized from other people to favoured client groups and NGOs and businesses. Oh yes, scared yet? You should be, because it's not going to just be crofters, is it? We know crofters have been downput, so crofters must be allowed to buy the land. Now there's maybe a certain justification, possibly historical, for that. But how long will it be before they decide sustainable development includes wind farms? So you must have your land seized and handed over to a wind farm developer so they can put windmills on your land which you don't want.
It's a nightmare.
There is nothing you can do to stop it. It's coming to an estate near you sometime soon. But let us move on once more. There's
actually one more point. They've actually got a clause in that land reform bill that said you can take land, the government can basically decide to take land if it's deemed to be in the public interest. But the public
As you
interest
say,
is utterly undefined.
But that's exactly the same thing, isn't it? It's exactly the same thing. What is the public interest? It's what the SNP minister decides is the public interest. So let's move one bit further.
The client group point's interesting because if you think what happened with Tea in the Park You know, their client group includes some very wealthy people with whom they do business.
I make no comment. But can we move on to
Yes.
the next bit? In 2006, the then Labour-run Holyrood Scottish Executive, the Labour were slightly less egotistical, is that the word we're looking for?
Elitist.
Elitist, yes, they only call themselves an executive, not a government. However, they published plans for national ID cards from Scotland. Now, the SNP, to its great credit, opposed them tooth and nail. Then Labour, of course, lost the next election, and suddenly the SNP were in charge. Well, they didn't have a majority at that point, and they needed other people's votes. They needed the Tory votes or the Lib Dems votes to get their bills through. And the Lib Dems and the Tories were vehemently opposed to ID cards, and indeed still are vehemently opposed to ID cards. Well, give credit where credit's due, they are. So the SNP stuck to its guns and stuck to its opposition, and despite the importunings of police brass hats and various civil servants, they refused to countenance the idea. However, power, as they say, corrupts. And by 2014, our SNP friends were starting to renege on their previous commitments. Now, the infrastructure for a national database underpinning has always been there. There is something called the National Health Service Central Register. Now, what that is, it has a unique, everybody has a unique NHS number which they are allocated when they are born, or when the NHS was created, and that records who was born, who dies, and who's registered with what GP, and that's really all it does. That's all it does. But it is a unique identifier for every citizen. Now, let's be honest, if we want an NHS, that's probably reasonably a good idea. However, the SNP decided, in the interests of efficiency, to allow data sharing with other official bodies. And SNP ministers have given themselves the powers under the radar. They haven't published any bill. It's not through primary legislation, despite the efforts of the opposition parties at Holyrood, to be fair to them. The Lib Dems proposed an amendment trying to force primary legislation for any national database. They were outvoted 65-60. The SNP even pulling back ministers from maternity leave to get their vote through to prevent this attempt to force primary legislation and thus a debate. So what we've got is, just like corroboration, the SNP have prevented any debate on this, and they've just quietly accumulated powers to themselves. Ministers can now allow various types of data sharing. They will only have to ship a few some postcodes, a few identifiers onto the systems, add a little bit of information here, a bit of information there, and more organisations get access to more and more information. Now, naturally, with so many organisations having access, your NHS number will be more and more in demand, because they will use it as a key to find you. So whether it's your local library, or your GP, or Carmack, the ferry company, yeah, or the Forestry Commission, or Scottish Canals, or the Drinking Quality Water Regulator. I kid you not, these last four are all on the list of organisations. There's over 120, but these last four are all on the list. There are others which include, I think it's the Meat Quality Control Board and what have you. All of these will start asking for our NHS number so that they can access the information they want. In effect, your NHS number becomes a de facto ID number without any legislation being passed. And once they attach that to entitlement, for example, anyone got a Young Scot card?
Yep.
Yep. Attach it to that. Anyone got a old person's bus pass? You attach it to that. And suddenly, you are carrying a de facto ID card. You've not been asked for it, they've not passed any legislation, but it's a de facto ID card. That's what it actually is in all intents and purposes. Now, data protection, luckily for us, still protects us. The Information Commissioner's Office has stated that adding postcodes shifts the SNP's plans away from any consensual model, that the proposals breach both UK and EU law. Now, we're not obviously in UKIP that worried about EU law, but breaching UK law is always a bad thing. And that, they quote, the unique identifier is the first step on the road to a national ID card. The SNP's response, it has consulted. There are safeguards in place.
I'll bet there are.
Yeah,
It's
right.
Orwellian, isn't it?
Doesn't this all make you feel wonderful to live in SNP land? Okay, so
This is a new world order.
So let's just move us on to a summary here. There is, as I mentioned earlier, a clear pattern to all of the examples I've given. A common thread running through everything. Any idea, anyone to suggest what the thread might be?
Centralisation of power.
To a degree.
This
No.
is what the EU
It's
is about.
essentially,
It's trust.
Yeah.
It's trust. The SNP does not trust us to sing songs without rioting. It does not trust us to act as jurors to try and convict or acquit according to evidence. It does not trust us to drink responsibly. It does not trust us to understand the dangers of smoking. It does not trust us to bring up our own children. The SNP does not trust us with our own property, for God's sake. It does not even trust us to be who we say we are. The SNP, and I've looked into this, and I've tried to find a reason for this lack of trust, and I've come to the conclusion that the Scottish National Party is convinced that the SNP, and only the SNP, knows what is right and just and proper, and that no one else can be trusted to know what is right and just and proper.
Which is why they're now pushing for a second independence referendum.
So, the Scottish National Party, in order to impose what is right and just and proper on all the rest of us, is systematically salami slicing and dismantling our rights and our liberties. They're banning and they're legislating, taxing us, numbering us, spying on us. See, the people of Scotland didn't swallow the SNP's propaganda. In September last year, the people of Scotland said no. The people of Scotland wanted to stay in the Union. So the people of Scotland must be punished.
They'll keep giving a referendum until they get the answer they want.
And to do that, to punish us, to ensure that what is right and proper in the SNP thought, they have centralised the police force. They have put pressure on the courts and on the media, especially BBC Scotland. Anybody see their idea for a federal BBC came out this week?
They don't even believe in a federal Britain, but they believe in a
Federal BBC will allow them to run BBC Scotland.
The British, the bloated broadcasting corporation.
Of course, but a BBC Scotland run from Scotland exclusively will be subject to domination by Hollywood. And of course they have also given unprecedented powers to their apparatchiks to spy on the people, including sneaking in identity cards, as I've demonstrated, by the back door. But let's be clear here. We are not living in a police state. We're not living in a fascist state. We are not living under the jackboot of totalitarianism. Yet. The purpose of this talk was to bring all this to your attention and to ask questions. What do we do about it? What now? Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours.